I gave myself 20 minutes to talk about the SYNGAP story to date. And I was working on these slides on the plane, and I was working on these slides at about 4 a.m. this morning. And I decided to call this, we're at the end of the beginning, just to frame expectations. We have not even started yet. That was another title I considered. But let me just jump in. Oh, wait, do I have a clicker? I do. Does my clicker work, or do I need you guys if it's a PDF? Okay, so I want to make a couple observations up at the top. When I started this in 2018, my worldview was the OG was Mike Transfalia. There was this group called Gervais. There were other people, and then we were in the back row, right? I would go to meetings, and people were like, Sin, what? You're not Gervais? And the world was very small. And when I look at the world today, I think about neurodevelopmental disorders, neurodegenerative disorders, other various disorders. I think about the OGs, were the original gangsters, Fragile X, Rett, Dravet, Hunter, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, spinal muscular atrophy, EBRP. I think about leaders, people who I crib from liberally, Angelman, the SLCs, the SCNs, the people who are ahead of us by virtue of being larger, having been around longer, whatever. And I think about the next wave, and I put us in that next wave bucket, right? We are right next, we are elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder with FOXG1, ADMP, STX, KCNT1. And then the reason I put this table together is there's more genes behind us, and then there's 800 genes behind them. There's 800 genes behind them. So the way to think about what we're doing here is not just we got to raise money and help our kids. We have to realize that we need to find ways to collaborate with and compare us favorably to 800 other neurodevelopmental disorders. That is why it is so important that we keep our act together and up our game incessantly, because our industry partners do not wake up in the morning thinking about SYNGAP1. They wake up in the morning thinking about neurodevelopmental disorders or just neurodisorders. And it's important to dive deep on SYNGAP and understand what we're doing, but it's also important to realize we are playing in a very complicated ecosystem that is growing rapidly, right? So just as I think about the past 5 years, what I thought about on day one in 2018 when I started this, and how I think about the world today. The other thing that's evolved a lot before I jump into telling the story, I said it was a mistake to give me a mic, I'm going to walk around, is in 2018 I thought we had to learn from doctors, I thought we had to give them samples, I thought we just had to give them money, I thought we had to fill in surveys, find clinics, and just fund research and hope they did something with it. I literally wrote people checks and said, call me when you're done. I was so dumb, and I don't do that anymore. Now, I think we have to teach doctors. I think we have to invest in young clinicians, and I think we have to build relationships with senior clinicians, people like Dr. Helbig, Dr. Baduri, Dr. Levine, people you heard from yesterday. I used to say, take my blood, do something with it. Now I think we have to own the samples. We have to build the cell lines. If you have a missense mutation, I've told you to make a cell line, and I'm still telling you. We have to build a biobank, and thank God for Combined Brain, we have one. Again, I thought we had to just give people money and let them do work. Now I understand we have to call them every 3 months and drive them, and we have to be participants in that. What's going on? How can I help? What are you finding? What do you think? I used to fill in surveys, and now I want to promote registries and build better surveys, which is what we're doing with Fraser. I used to wonder where I could go to get seen for SYNGAP1. The answer was nowhere. Now I think we have to seed those clinics. Colorado Children's, Stanford, KKI, BCH, CHOP. And then build a network between them. Make sure that Demarest at Colorado is working with Ingo at CHOP, et cetera. And instead of funding grants research passively, oh, you had an idea, researcher, let me give you money. I think we should talk about that idea and understand how it's going to result in medicines. We have to seed labs. For instance, Lacoste came at us 6 months ago with a proposal. We were like, we don't love this. You're not ready. But here's $20,000. Why don't you get some cell lines, stand things up, and then come back again? He came back again. We gave him a grant. We have to partner with researchers who care, Dr. Chow, Dr. Wilsey. We have to find people who aren't just brilliant and willing to work hard. That is necessary but not sufficient. They have to give a damn. Because I have in the past funded people who I concluded did not give a damn, and that was a mistake. And we have to be careful. So in the past 5 years, before I even tell you what's happened, the mindset, my understanding of the world around us and what we are here to do has changed radically. And I want to share that with you because I want you guys to think the same thing because we're on the same page. This is my killer slide. This is one of my killer slides. This is how I share this with industry all the time because people need this context. Syngap was discovered in 1998. That's that first button. What you're seeing across the x-axis is the number of papers in PubMed describing SYNGAP1. My dear friend Nasha Fitter looks at the slide, tells me I'm an idiot. She says, papers don't cure kids. This is irrelevant. Why do you care about papers? She's a little bit right, but she's a little bit wrong. Because if there's no papers, then there's no basic science, right? So you can see here that those lines are going up on the right. The first patient was found in 2009. That is 14 years ago. This room couldn't have existed in 2008. This disease did not exist in 2008. We've only been at this for 14 years, if you want to understand how small we are. Tony was diagnosed in 2018. That's a picture of him in a paper. And I'm not claiming responsibility for these other publications, to be clear. In 2019, thank God, Dr. Sheffer, who was here with us yesterday, published this paper in Neurology, first author of last camp. It was described 47 SYNGAP patients. In the next year, Satterstrom et al. Is a very important paper, which is that little table you see there, came out and said, what are the genetic causes of autism? And SYNGAP was one of the top 3. Ooh, what happened to that picture? The year after that, in large part because of Hans Schlecht and in part also because of the work of SRF and our willingness to fund a lawsuit against HHS, which is a funny story I'll tell you another time, we secured an ICD-10 code, which every rare disease is jealous of. And we begged for that for 2 years. And to be clear, it was 4 hours after we sent a draft complaint, we were ready to file in federal court, that was approved. So sometimes you got to be feisty. Last year, Ionis, Praxis, Acadia, Stoke, all and Ionis via public comments made by Mem Prosser, all indicated they had ASOs and were considering working on SYNGAP1. And then you see that next table, which is Fu et al., which was a bigger study. And when I mean big, I mean tens of thousands of patients that identified SYNGAP as the 4th most associated gene with autism. This drove huge commercial interest. And this year, we've seen Regal and Penn announce their work. Of course, others, and as we heard yesterday from Hans, he's already secured an ICD-11 code. If you want my lecture on ICD codes, go look up the blog. But this is just context. SYNGAP was only identified in 1998. The first patient 14 years ago. SRF is 5 years old. Okay, we are at the end of the beginning. How to think about the past 5 years? Well, in 2018, when I was diagnosed, I said, how many patients are there? Someone said 1 to 200. I called them a year later. I said, how many patients are there now? They said 1 to 200. I said, I've seen a new patient on the Facebook group every week. You're clearly not paying attention. Dare I say, you're making up numbers. So I started counting. I called everybody. I called Danny. I called Verena. I called people all around the world. I said, how many patients? We went through lists. Where's Virginia? We counted, and I put up a blog. You can go read it. I said, I think there's about 300 patients in the world, and I know this number's wrong. Ashley's telling me I've got 5 minutes. I'm telling her I'm going to go 10. And then over those quarters, we constantly updated and counted the number of patients that we could find. Right? So if we can find 1,300 patients as of the end of last quarter, I can tell you there's a lot more than that diagnosed, and I can tell you there's tens of thousands more who aren't diagnosed. How to think about the past 5 years? Well, when I'm talking to industry, I put this slide up. We're 5 years old. We've committed $5 million to research. We've had 20 families serve on our board. We've profiled almost 200 patients on our site. We have partner operations in multiple geographies. We have 220 patients verified in Citizen in the US. That's more than half of the diagnosed population that we're aware of. We supported over a score of institutions. We have webinars. And we have now 2 ICD codes. It's pretty good. Industry sort of sits up when they see that. They say, okay, you guys might be doing something useful. When I think about it, I look at this. How much have we spent on research over the past 5 years? We've committed. We've signed or have told people we will sign. We just gave another round of grants. Over $5 million in research funding. That's 43 different grants. And to be clear, Pavel's done most of that work. This is a Herculean task. I was very busy doing it in the early years when it was 5 grants, 3 grants, 3 grants. Then it got busy and Hans was like, dude, just move over. I can do this better than you. Thank God for, not Hans, Pavel. Thank God, because it was a ton of work. We launched Citizen in 2020 and started recruiting. You can see the numbers there. CHOP this year added 38. We had a meeting every year for 5 years. We've also had meetings in Spanish, and as you're sitting in the second family meeting, we've profiled warriors, we've made family movies, global organizations, belong to umbrella orgs, we've made podcasts. It has been a heck of a 5 years. But the numbers that actually really, and then I would talk about meetings. This was the first roundtable. So 2018, Tony's diagnosed. We talk to people. There's a whole story there. We set up SRF, and at the end of 2018, I went to the Dravet syndrome roundtable. That was 5 years ago. Last night I was there, so it had to be the 10th. Maybe it was the 9th, whatever. And I was sitting in the back of the room of all these researchers talking about how to cure Dravet, and I was like, why on earth do we not have this? And what I told myself at the end of 2018 is if I do nothing else in 2019, the day of the Dravet roundtable, we will have a Syngap breakfast, and this is that breakfast. You know it was 5 years ago because I have no hair there in the middle. And I was smarter back then because we took pictures. We didn't take a picture yesterday. And in that picture, you can see from the right, Rick Huganier, Ingrid Scheffer, Hans is in the back, Steve Petru, who's the scientist behind Praxis, Isabel Aznarez, Anna Mignoranzi. There are some real important people in this picture. That was 5 years ago. 2021, oh, by the way, we had a pandemic. But then last year, we came back in person, and then this was our roundtable, and you're sitting in the next version of this picture right now. It has been quite a journey over the past 5 years. We started like that. Last year we were this, and now you're here. How to think about the past 5 years? Well, I think about it in terms of grant making, because at the end of the day, money talks, and you know the rest of that expression. We have raised and committed funding to science, and we have all struggled with how to bucket our grants, but this is today's version. Version 1, create new therapies for SRID, Syngap-related intellectual disability. 2, fund basic science. Develop reagents. Reagents are things that scientists and industry can use. Understand SYNGAP1 better in order to understand this disease and work on missense. 3, clinical trial readiness, which means get the patients ready, have the endpoints, and build a clinical network. 4, small molecule repurposing. Are there drugs on the shelf at CVS we can use today? We've beat this point to death, and Mike Transfalia made it clearly. But how did I make up this chart? Well, I made up this chart by going back and saying, okay, when we started, what happened? Well, in 2018, guess what? I said, who's working on Syngap? There were 2 names. There was Rick Huganier and his postdoc, this guy named Gavin Rimbaugh, who was working with some other guy named Holder. That was the universe. Mistake number 1, I went to the existing players and I said, take my money. I made good investments and bad investments. We gave Rick Huganier $500,000. $250,000 of that was to make an ASO, and $250,000 was to make a mouse model. We gave Gavin and Jimmy money to keep going. It was not very smart. That was 2018. In 2019, we discovered Liz Heller, who was a Syngap aunt at Penn, and she was an epigenetics person. And we said, maybe you can study epigenetics, which is the things that affect the gene, and make a therapy. So I sort of bucket 18 and 19 because we really didn't go public till 19. This is how we started. So we were already working on new therapies, reagents, and understanding SYNGAP1. New stuff is in blue. In 2020, we discovered Marcelo Koba, who explained to us that organoids were better than iPSCs, and we should work with him to make iPSCs. This is entirely Hans. Hans connected with Koba. Koba's been a wonderful asset. And we gave him 2 grants. We gave him $40,000 at the beginning of the year to do an MEA, and then we gave him a real grant at the end of the year. We also met Citizen and decided that Citizen and its retrospective natural history study and collecting these medical records was smart. Back then, Citizen was charging, and when they told me the price, I was like, all day long, take our money, and we signed up for that. And then we also met Tom Frazier, who hopefully you met and were impressed with yesterday, and we gave him a very small grant to start working. So now we're working on new therapies, basic science, and thinking about clinical trials. That was at the end of 2020. By the way, that asterisk means, remember, this was during a pandemic. 2021. 2020 was also when I left my career and started doing this full-time pro bono. 2021, full-blown pandemic, but we weren't stopping. We realized that for reagents, people needed iPSCs, induced pluripotent stem cells, so we started working with Rarebase on those. We also started working with Combined Brain to do a repository with them. We met Dr. Padori. Ann had been on our scientific advisory board for years, but we gave Harvard almost $250,000, actually over $250,000, both to study our citizen data and also to start doing the EEG work that you heard about yesterday from Dr. Levine. Note, this was over 2 years ago. The talk you heard yesterday from Dr. Levine that was so awesome, we funded over 2 years ago. These things take time. This point will land when you see the next 2 slides. We met Dr. Ziegler and started working with her through Combined Brain, and we also started working with Rare Base on small molecule repurposing. Pretty good. Nice organic growth. Last year was nuts. We gave more money to Heller. We discovered Zemplenty and funded that. We met Anderson and did a Me Too on Angelman. You're all taking pictures. Just email me for the deck. You can have it. We met Dr. Collar, who's the genius behind Tevard, and gave him some money for RNA. And we also gave a large grant to Edinburgh. Edinburgh, there's a huge SYNGAP1 operation. There's a good guy there named Cobb. We gave some grant to some Canadians to do mice stuff. It was cheap. We wanted to make friends. And we decided to make a mouse. We made that mouse. That's that Jackson line right there. We made that mouse at the request of Tevard so they could test their tRNAs that they talked about yesterday. Dr. Koba's work had turned promising. He'd introduced us to Dr. Quadrato. We funded that. We made that seed grant to Dr. Lacoste. And we met Michael Courtney and took over work from Leon and Friends on the missense. We gave a much larger grant to Rare Base to scale up their work. We met Dr. Bowie and gave him some work. And we also funded a potential work at BCH. You heard about some, but not all of this. Actually, you've heard about at most half of this yesterday. This is all seeds we planted that have not even sprouted yet. It's pretty good. 2023 has been nuts. More money to Jackson to characterize the mouse. More money to Zemplenty. A new grant to Knowles to look at the sources of SYNGAP seizures. Another grant to Lacoste. A grant to Dr. Wilsey, who you met yesterday. A grant to Edinburgh to expand their work on which cell types it happens in. The grant to Pastilla, who you met yesterday, to do in silico scale-up of what Courtney's doing on missense. A small grant to Jillian McKee at CHOP to do something. A grant to Katie Cunine, who you heard from yesterday, the young medical student who spoke so beautifully and did that early DCM work. A grant to Dr. Andrade to do the adult study, which you'll hear more about later today. A follow-up grant to Dr. Frazier. A grant to Dr. Davinsky on seizure reporting. Ongoing support for travel costs. If there's a family who wants to go to CHOP and they can't afford it and CHOP can't afford to help them, we will. More money to Rare Base, a grant to Dr. Chow, and we've offered Dr. Grinspan money to help him speed up. This is how I think about the past 5 years. And you can see just how dense this chart is on the right and how light it is on the left, that things are getting hectic. And you start asking questions like, can we keep this up? Both in terms of, can we raise another $2 million a year? And we are now managing over 40 grants. So the can we keep it up is an interesting conversation, but my answer is simple. We don't have a choice. Our kids are sick, right? I'm not going to walk away from this. None of us can walk away from this because if you remember that early slide, there's a lot of genes out there who will happily take the time and attention and partnership of the clinicians we have worked so hard to get our cell lines in their lab, our gene on their whiteboards, and their people thinking about our kids. Ashley's about to give me the hook. So we've worked with all these great people. We have all these great people internally. We have these incredible podcasts, which we use. And these podcasts aren't just an efficient way to communicate. They're a way for us to find patients and stay aligned. And I'll talk more about this at the end of the day. But everything we've done, we're at the end of the beginning, pales in comparison to what's next. These therapies are coming, but we don't have a clinical network. We've got to build that up. We've got to test all these small molecules that Dr. Chow and Rare Base are bringing to us. We've got to get ready for clinical trials, not just by making endpoints, but as I said to those of us who were in the AM session, by mentally, academically, and organizationally preparing for clinical trials. Do we understand what an ASO is? Have we thought through the implications? Are we as an organization ready to partner with industry to recruit for these things? Because that's what I'm thinking about. And then how are we going to keep finding more and more patients to grow this, to think about it different ways, to grow this community, to feed the trials, but also as hard as our lives are, what are people doing who have a Syngapian that don't know they have a Syngapian? We've all been there. And as tough as this is, at least we've got each other, right? So that's how I think about the Syngap story to date. I thought it was helpful context to share with you guys as we think about this community for the rest of the day. I think it's important to hear that story right up against Mike Transvalia, who's been working so hard for 30 years. I'm into your break, so I'll shut up. But thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of SRF. It's better to be lucky than good. This is why I loved how Mike ended. Right now, we are lucky to be where we are. We just have gotten lucky many times, and this is ours to lose. We have to stay together. We have to keep working. We are this close to actually having therapies for our kids. Thank you. Join us. Time is brain. Over to you.